Sometimes the scariest part of a horror movie isn't what happens in it, but how it makes you feel about every bump in the night for the rest of your life. These are just a few examples of those special scary films.
One of the most memorable scenes in Hereditary is the closing scene in the treehouse, in which Peter, now housing the demonic Paimon's soul, is crowned the king of hell on earth. For the kinds of viewers who didn't care for the movie, this ending came out of nowhere. But to viewers who paid close attention, who read the literal writing on the walls, this scene was the culmination of every single frame of the film up to that point. The closing scene is a testament to the scariest machinations of the cult of Paimon. Throughout the whole film, the cult manipulates nearly every event, from the funeral to Charlie's death, to Annie's desperate spiral into spiritualism, to Peter's utter mental and physical collapse. We even learn that the cult stretches back generations before the events of the film, leading to the deaths of Annie's father and brother and even the births of her children. From the shadows, they manipulate everything that befalls the Graham family until all that's left is Peter's broken shell with a demon filling. But why should we be afraid, apart from the film's shocking imagery? What's to fear? Demons aren't real, right? Wait, is Paimon real? Well, Paimon is as real as any demon is real, which depends on your personal worldview. But he's as real as any of those demons that were famously tamed by King Solomon. Paimon appears in the 16th century grimoire known as the Lesser Key of Solomon, arguably the most influential work of demonology of all time. According to the Lesser Key, Paimon is a king of hell who wears a crown and rides a camel, preceded by the sound of trumpets. If you invoke him, he can grant you knowledge of all arts and sciences and secret knowledge of the earth, wind, and waters. Furthermore, he can grant you good familiars and dignities and lordships, as well as revealing hidden treasures. Writer-director Ari Aster goes to some pains to be accurate in his depiction of Paimon, though he embellishes in a few places. For example, the idea that Paimon requires a male host seems to be an original idea, though Paimon is sometimes described as having a woman's face, so gender issues are not out of nowhere. But is Paimon himself out of nowhere in the movie? What are signs of his presence? One of the biggest clues to Paimon's presence is his symbol, which can be found lurking in many crucial scenes. Annie and her mother are both seen wearing necklaces with the seal of Paimon at the first funeral. Once Joan is revealed as a cult member, you can see Paimon's seal on her wall. Most significantly, though, you can see Paimon's seal carved on the utility pole where Charlie will later be decapitated, which reveals how even that shocking event was orchestrated by the cult of Paimon. The most literal sign of Paimon's presence, however, is the glimmering blue light that indicates he is manipulating events. Besides the obvious moments of possession, close viewing will catch this light knocking over Annie's paint bottle and popping up during key events at Peter and Charlie's school. Besides Paimon, there's one character in Hereditary whose presence is the most pervasive in the film despite being literally defined by her absence: Ellen, Annie's mother, and Peter and Charlie's grandmother. Ellen is the catalyst for everything in the movie from any angle. As a leader in the cult of Paimon, her desire to provide a host for her demon king is the driving force behind the shadow conspiracy that wrecks the Graham family. Likewise, her death and the complicated feelings this stirs up in Annie led to a lot of the emotional conflict in the film. But going back even further, it was her treatment of Annie as a child that teaches Annie how to deal with her own children, a lineage of abuse and poor communication that culminates with Annie's explosion at the dinner table.
And I know you're in pain, and I wish I could take that away for you. I wish I could shield you from the knowledge that you did what you did, but your sister is dead!
More than any demon or cultist, it's Ellen's toxic presence that leads to the ruin of 3 generations of a family. Her lifetime of machinations led to the film's most tragic events in a practical sense, but it's her emotional abuse of her family that creates the environment that makes the family's total disillusion possible. But what is it that makes a crappy grandma a scarier proposition than a king of hell? If a scene takes place in a classroom, you should pay attention to the lecture. That's because there's a good chance the teacher will say something thematically relevant. Peter sits in on 3 classes where the movie's theme is, in some cases, literally written on a chalkboard. The final classroom scene has only a snippet of discussion of Aeschylus's Oresteia, a trilogy of plays about the cycle of intergenerational violence, with the words "punishment brings wisdom" somewhat ominously written on the board. Meanwhile, a history class discusses the Great Depression, which is reflective of the, Great Depression Peter suffers after Charlie's accident. Sometimes things are just that straightforward. However, the first scene is the most telling. Peter's English teacher is discussing Sophocles' tragedy Trachiniae, while Peter texts his friend. The discussion centers on how the tragedy of the play is heightened by Heracles' futile attempts to escape his unconditional fate and how his attempt to control his destiny is an arrogance that is his fatal flaw. Unfortunately, this was an English class Peter and his mom probably should have paid attention to. It's tragic. As Peter's classmate would say,
I think it's more tragic because if it's all just inevitable, then that means that the characters had no hope.
one of the most striking elements of the movie is Annie's miniatures. As the film goes on, it becomes clear that these miniatures are representations of emotional and even traumatic moments in Annie's life that she uses to try to process her feelings toward these moments. Her mother's funeral, her mother's bizarre behavior in her final days, Charlie's death, and so on. In one of the movie's blackest, most absurdly comic moments, Annie defends her choice to make a miniature of Charlie's death scene to her husband, Stephen.
It's not about him.
Oh, no?
No, it's a neutral view of the accident.
Clearly creating an objective third-person view of these terrible moments is Annie's attempt at exerting some control over these things that made her feel powerless. By stripping the scenes of subtext, she can hope to finally understand the text of them. But as director Ari Aster tells Variety, this is at best an illusion of control. The constant framing of the Graham house in such a way that it often becomes impossible to distinguish real house from miniature house is no coincidence. The Grahams themselves are merely dolls living in a dollhouse, puppets whose strings are held by Ellen, by Paimon, by the cult, by fate itself. This, or at least Peter's classmates would assert, makes the fall of the House of Graham all the more tragic. Aster describes the story of Hereditary to Variety in a surprisingly succinct elevator pitch. It's a story about a long-lived possession ritual told from the perspective of the sacrificial lamb. From the very first frame of this movie, Peter is manipulated by others toward his fate, by his grandmother's manipulations, by his mother's emotional abuse, and even by a literal demon. He's led like an unwitting lamb to slaughter until he is physically and emotionally broken down enough to be receptive to Paimon's possession. Hereditary is Lovecraftian in the sense that it examines regular people who find themselves confronted with forces so beyond their everyday comprehension that facing it head-on destroys their sanity and ultimately their lives. Paimon's logic is not human logic, and any attempts to impose such logic on the tragedies befalling the Grahams has disastrous consequences. And while Peter is Paimon's main focus, no one suffers the consequences of trying to control fate more than Annie. The obvious question to ask over the course of the movie is, has Annie lost her mind? Her psychiatrist husband seems to think so, as we even see him drafting an email to a colleague about Annie's possible breakdown. Mental illness, we hear, runs in her family. Her mother suffered dissociative identity disorder, her father starved himself to death, and her brother committed suicide in an apparent schizophrenic episode. But within the literal reality of the movie, it's possible most of these diagnoses were misunderstandings of demonic activity. Annie's brother, the original Charlie, was at least telling the truth. His mother really was trying to put someone inside him.
My older brother had schizophrenia, and when he was 16, he hanged himself in my mother's bedroom, and of course his suicide note blamed her, accusing her of putting people inside him.
Annie isn't suffering a breakdown, she's reacting to literal reality around her. In fact, the least rational thing she tries to do is impose logic on an illogical world. Her attempts to impose order and save her family only make things worse. She tries to contact Charlie to soothe that pain and summons Paimon's loose spirit into their home. The worst example of this, however, comes when Annie tries to have a grand redemptive moment by sacrificing herself for her family by throwing the notebook into the fire, expecting it to consume her. Of course, her husband is burned to death instead. And why wouldn't he be? Why should Annie catch fire this time just because she did before? Paimon's logic is not human logic. But while the presence of mental illness within the literal reality of Hereditary is ambiguous at best, it is impossible to deny the looming shadow it casts over the film on a metaphorical level. The mental illness passed down from Ellen to Annie and her brother, and then to Peter and Charlie, is merely one element that moves from generation to generation. Ellen's emotional abuse is passed on from mother to daughter, despite Annie's best attempts to remove herself from it. The keeping of secrets and issues with communicating also cross generational lines. Ultimately, Peter bears the brunt of all this pain in the way that mental illness, abuse, and intergenerational trauma ate his family from the inside. Aster sums it up when he told Vox that the movie is ultimately about how trauma can utterly transform a person and not necessarily for the better. You can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family, or so the saying goes. You might not believe in fate, and you might not believe in demon cults manipulating your life. You might fully believe in the pure existence of free will and that we as humans choose our own destinies. But there are some forces that determine facts about us completely outside our capacity to choose. Our DNA and the traits we derive from it, the traumas we inherit from our families, the scars they put in us. Even if you fully abandon your family, cutting them off entirely, you still carry them with you, both in your genes and in your neuroses. More than the idea of being responsible for the death of a loved one, more than the fear of ghosts lurking in the corner, more than multiple decapitations, the scary thing about Hereditary is that there are things in our lives that we absolutely cannot control. Our loved ones will change. Our loved ones will die. We are destined, in one way or another, to become our parents. It is impossible for any of us to ever truly know someone. And all these things are terrifying. A lot of horror movies seem to lose their impact over time. Very few people today above elementary school age would find much to be afraid of in the universal chillers of the 30s and 40s, despite the reputations they have as groundbreaking classics today. There's no shortage of reasons for this, including the evolving broadening of what is seen as acceptable in popular culture, viewers being desensitized to things that were shocking in past eras, and so on. Regardless of what lies behind this phenomenon, the fact is that over the course of 40 years, The Shining has maintained its reputation as one of the scariest movies ever made, and it's arguable that this reputation has only grown over that time. A big part of its success comes from the way the film plays up the physical space, an enormous, quiet, empty hotel that maybe isn't quite as empty as advertised. The fear that we all experience in a big, empty building that anything could be lurking around the corner is made very real when Danny turns a corner on his tricycle and encounters the ghostly Grady twins, possibly the most iconic moment in a movie full of iconic images. Soon the Overlook is full to bursting with ghosts, bartenders appearing from nowhere, revelers with bleeding scalps, parties filling what should be empty ballrooms, naked ladies who aren't what they seem, and, that guy in the costume. The lingering notion that anything could be anywhere at any time the way the hotel ghosts are is one that tends to stay with viewers way more than any jump scare. The feeling of doubting your own senses and the ambiguity of what should be reality are a big part of why The Shining remains the major cultural touchstone that it is.
You went into the room Danny said? To 237?
Yes, I did.
And you didn't see anything at all?
Absolutely nothing.
The Shining poses a lot of questions that are not necessarily answered in the film itself, or at least not without close or repeated viewings. In fact, deep readings discussing what The Shining is really about are so common that there's actually a documentary on the phenomenon called Room 237 after the notorious hotel room where something happens to Danny. According to people in this documentary, The Shining is, despite appearances, actually a movie about American imperialism and the genocide of Native Americans.
The site is supposed to be located on an Indian burial ground, and I believe they actually had to repel a few Indian attacks as they were building it.
Or actually, it's about the Holocaust and that genocide. Or maybe it's a secret retelling of the myth of Theseus in the Labyrinth of the Minotaur. Or, perhaps most famously, it's Stanley Kubrick's secret confession that he was involved in faking the moon landing. Did you know that if you play the movie forward and backward at the same time, stuff happens? It's a lot. With all those conflicting interpretations, at least there's one thing we can all agree on. This is definitely a movie about a haunted hotel, right? Right? A relatively common strategy in horror movie criticism is to ask what's really happening in the movie if there's nothing actually supernatural going on. The goal is to figure out the metaphor behind the supernatural presence and thereby get to the thematic meat of the film. All of the spooky, scary stuff becomes the result of dreams, hallucinations, rumors, and urban legends. While this can often be a useful tool for looking at stories from a new angle, it's not universally helpful. That said, maybe there weren't any ghosts in the Overlook Hotel.
It's just like pictures in a book, Danny. It isn't real.
Roger Ebert's review of The Shining, for example, features the fairly common interpretation along those lines that recasts all of the movie's ghosts as visions and hallucinations by Jack and Danny. But if this is true and the ghosts aren't even a thing, then what's the real threat to the Torrance family? If you only know one piece of trivia about Stanley Kubrick's Shining adaptation, it's likely the fact that author Stephen King famously hates it. He hates it so much that he had it remade as a TV miniseries in the mid-90s, starring the fourth most famous person from the sitcom Wings in the Jack Nicholson role. If you haven't seen it, here's a spoiler. It's bad. But King is happier with it as an adaptation than he is with a film regarded as a crowning achievement in a genre and one of the best films of all time. Why, you might rightly ask yourself? Why would King hate Kubrick's The Shining so much? Well, according to King himself, much of it has to do with Jack's character. He never cared for the casting of Jack Nicholson, in part because Nicholson was so well known for his role in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, in which he plays a patient at a mental hospital. This, King thinks, gives away the game by basically telling viewers that Jack will go crazy. In fact, King argues that Jack is unhinged from the first moment we see him, which means he has no real character arc. For King, the tragedy of the story is seeing an ordinary man overwhelmed by evil, and Kubrick's adaptation loses that sense of tragedy. Consider, though, what if this is only part of the reason? See if you can tell who this is describing. A writer and a father of a young child whose issues with rage and substance abuse manifest themselves as antagonism toward that child. If you guessed that it refers to The Shining's central character Jack Torrance, you're correct. If you guessed that it also refers to The Shining's author Stephen King at the time of the novel's composition, you are also correct. The Shining is a very personal work for King, and Jack Torrance is the character he most closely identified with, even speaking about how the inspiration for the book came from his own occasional, but very real feelings of antagonism toward his own children.
I did hurt him once, okay? It was an accident.
While King's Jack is an ordinary man who is driven to violence, literally transformed by the influence of alcohol and the evil presence in the Overlook, Kubrick says that his adaptation is more about the evil side of humanity as a whole. As King's criticism rightly points out, Kubrick's Jack is crazy and violent from the beginning. The hotel just gives him an outlet. So while King might say he doesn't like Kubrick's film for its narrative shortcomings, isn't it possible that he also doesn't like what the movie seems to say about him as a person? If Jack is bad from the start, what does that say about King? One convincing line of argument about The Shining is that Jack is the only real threat and that, indeed, there are no ghosts in the Overlook at all. Jack's visions are the result of cabin fever and/or alcohol withdrawal, Danny's shining visions are dreams, and so on. Of course, this particular argument raises the question of who lets Jack out of the storage room after Wendy locks him in there, but there are theories and explanations for that as well if you want to dig into it. If there are no ghosts in the Overlook Hotel, the only malevolent force, the only real danger, is Jack Torrance himself and the abusive behavior toward the wife and son that he brought into the hotel with him. Let's look at one of the most notorious scenes in the film, the one the documentary was named after, the ghost in room 237. Taking the film's narrative at face value, we see Danny lured to the room, which is thought to be locked but is instead open. He subsequently appears with bruising on his neck, saying a crazy woman tried to strangle him. Jack later investigates the room and finds the ghost of a naked woman who is at first attractive to him, but then turns into an old crone with rotting flesh. He then tells Wendy he saw nothing.
I think he did it to himself.
Okay, so if there are no ghosts in the Overlook, who strangled Danny, and how do you explain what Jack saw? Filmmaker and analyst Rob Ager suggests that the answer can be found in a scene that seems otherwise innocuous, the one in which Danny comes in for his toy truck and Jack tells him how much he loves him. The short version of Ager's breakdown is that this scene, which is notably scored with very dramatic and ominous music, is cut off before we can see Jack strangling Danny for waking him up. Danny never goes into room 237, and neither does Jack. Jack's encounter with the woman in 237 is Danny having a dream that mirrors his own frightening experience with his father.
You did this to him, didn't you?
Many commentators, especially those who espouse the no-ghost theory, have noted that in every scene in which Jack encounters a ghost, there is a mirror present, or, in the case of the storeroom, a polished metal door, and that Jack is always facing them. From one perspective, that could simply mean that Jack is literally seeing things, misinterpreting a reflection as something else. On a more symbolic level, it's a reflection of that evil side Kubrick sees in humanity. But the fact is that duality and reflection are everywhere throughout the film, from the red rum written on the wall to the Grady twins to the second Jack in the photo at the end, and so on. Doubles are everywhere in The Shining. An exceptional essay from Catapult goes into how the motif of doubles plays into the theory of the uncanny, the idea of taking something familiar and twisting it just enough to make it unsettling. The Shining is all about ambiguity and doubt, and this sense of uncertainty and unease is the same as that felt by victims of abuse. The power dynamics of an abusive relationship are partly based on causing one's victims to doubt their instincts, creating false senses of security through doubt and gaslighting, turning a home into a place of insecurity and terror, as Jack does to Wendy and Danny, and indeed as the movie does to its viewers. One of the most discussed shots in the film comes at the very end, after Jack is frozen to death and Wendy and Danny have escaped, when the camera slowly zooms in on a photograph from a July 4th party from 1921, which clearly shows Jack among the revelers in the ballroom. Kubrick has said in no uncertain terms before that this, quote, suggests a reincarnation for Jack Torrance.
Been away, but now I'm back.
Good evening, Mr. Torrance. It's good to see you.
It's good to be back, Lloyd.
The idea of reincarnation is not isolated to Jack. There's also the implication that Charles Grady, the previous caretaker of the Overlook who murdered his family, is the reincarnation of Delbert Grady, the butler who tells Jack that he's always been the caretaker. The idea of reincarnation not only reinforces the motif of doubles seen throughout the film, it also bears the symbolic weight of the cycle of abuse. Violence is often, but by no means always, passed down from one generation to the next, as our parents and others close to us are the ones who teach us how to behave and interact with others, even if only subconsciously. Somewhat ironically, the novel version of The Shining gives even more focus to the idea of the cycle of violent abuse by giving the story of Jack's father, himself a belligerent drunk who abused Jack. While Jack's father does not appear and is not mentioned in the film, Rob Ager argues that it is actually him talking to the bartender about accidentally hurting his son. Nevertheless, the film makes it clear that the history of violence at the Overlook goes back generations, literally to its foundation on stolen native land. Violence begets violence, and the fact that Kubrick decided to leave the Overlook standing at the end as opposed to King, who blew it up, lingering on the haunting image of former life Jack, hints strongly at the immortality of evil. While it seems at the end that Wendy and Danny have escaped Jack, and metaphorically the cycle of abuse, the track record at the Overlook seems to indicate that the lure of evil is hard to resist. While deluges of blood and ghostly twins are pretty spooky images, the idea that each of us plays host to potential violence is a much more haunting idea. While constantly working to restrain our darker impulses may seem like it will make us dull boys, consider how it worked out for Jack.
Michael Myers is arguably one of the greatest figures in the history of horror cinema, and absolutely one of the most influential. The host of slasher killers that have followed in his wake are either directly inspired by him or were created as a reaction to his presence. The slasher subgenre dominated horror in the 80s, and a large part of that trend was the influence of Halloween in general, and Michael Myers specifically. So what actually makes Myers so great? Well, part of it is the look, which became instantly iconic when the movie debuted in 1978. But the real crux of his appeal can be found in the name he's given in the credits of the film, The Shape. Michael is barely meant to be a human character. Rather, he is a lurching, inexorable vessel for evil who can never be stopped. He's not a man. He's just a container for senseless and random violence. That inscrutability is a big part of what makes Michael Myers so terrifying. The idea that nobody can reach him or reason with him.
What was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
It doesn't help that a barrage of bullets to the chest can't stop him either, but he's not the scariest thing in Halloween, not by a long shot. Halloween is generally regarded as the movie that kicked off the slasher fad that dominated horror cinema from the late 1970s to the mid-1980s. But it's pretty rare that a genre just emerges out of nowhere. There are plenty of forerunners to Halloween's success that some horror fans would point to as earlier examples of the slasher genre. The most obvious would be 1974's Black Christmas, which pioneered that classic slasher setup. Young women being killed in a place they had previously assumed to be safe. Of course, the slasher genre would soon come to be more about the killer than their victims, and in Black Christmas, the killer is never even seen. But 1974's Texas Chainsaw Massacre puts Leatherface front and center as a hulking, masked killer just like Myers. Even earlier, the Italian giallo genre had brought the world murder mystery films featuring masked killers in urban settings. Mario Bava's A Bay of Blood from 1971, for example, is generally considered to be a proto-slasher. But these are more crime films than straightforward horror, and the victims are generally older than the ones you'll find in classic slashers. It was Halloween, then, that brought together all the elements people now expect from slasher movies: a subhuman masked killer, creative killings, gory violence, teenage protagonists, and, arguably most importantly, a suburban setting. To understand how movies like Halloween helped contemporize modern horror by moving the setting to the suburbs, you have to look at what horror looked like before the 1970s. Picture a black and white horror movie you've seen. Maybe it's Dracula or Frankenstein, or hey, maybe you're being extra fancy and picturing 1944's The Uninvited or something. Get you. Whatever it is though, the chances are the movie you're thinking of is part of the Gothic tradition that completely dominated horror movies for its earliest decades. The Gothic tradition goes back to 1764's The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. As film academic Pat Gill lays out in his paper on the subject, the defining characteristics of this subgenre include defenseless heroines, suppressed passions, unspeakable desires, fearful landscapes and haunted, uncanny interiors, and jarring juxtapositions of the moral and the monstrous, the sexual and the grotesque, the virtuous and the violent. While it's easy to draw a direct line from these elements to the modern slasher, this description better fits those old black and white Universal films, with their creepy castles, foggy moors, and beautiful haunted victims. Perhaps the most important characteristic of the Gothic genre is the setting. After all, it does share a name with an architectural style. The first recognized work of Gothic literature even has castle right in the title, and it's that castle, or spooky old house, or whatever else you like, that sets the foundation for the entire Gothic genre.
You mustn't go there. We people of the mountains believe at the castle there are vampires.
The idea that a house or a castle can hold dark secrets was such a key trope in the development of horror that the so-called Old Dark House actually emerged as its own subgenre. This is best seen in movies such as 1926's The Bat, in which a masked killer picks off guests in an isolated mansion one by one, and in 1927's The Cat and the Canary, in which a crazed killer escapes a mental institution and stalks a family through a creaky old mansion. Then there's 1932's The Old Dark House, which doesn't really need much of an explanation. The horror of these films came from the terrible secrets held by the houses and their histories. But how do you make a movie scary when it's set in a house that has only just been built? One of the key links between movies like The Bat and Halloween is Psycho, which, not incidentally, is also a movie that deals heavily with the theme of modernization. While Hitchcock's film is undeniably one of the most influential horror films of all time, Halloween wears its love of Psycho on its sleeve. Besides the fact that Halloween stars Jamie Lee Curtis, the daughter of Psycho's Janet Leigh, one of the main characters in Halloween is also named after a character from Psycho, Dr. Samuel Loomis. But the connection also goes much deeper than that. Psycho is a movie that takes events that would earlier have been set in a castle or mansion and moves them to a much more modern setting, a motel. And in Psycho, the Bates Motel is itself the victim of modernization. It has been more or less abandoned due to the development of the interstate highway system, which isolates the motel and allows Norman to do his thing away from prying eyes. The contrast between the mundane setting of Norman's murders and the elaborate, Gothic settings of old is made evident by the juxtaposition of the motel itself and the Bates family home. You see, there is actually a big spooky mansion in this movie, but it's long past its prime. Instead, the real horror of Psycho lies within the walls of Norman's motel. And with Psycho, the horror genre finally found its place in the modern world. The 1970s saw horror move to the suburbs, but now that the haunted house was out of the picture, how were you supposed to keep things creepy? Simple. As in The Exorcist and Poltergeist, you just have the ghost haunt a person rather than a place. Halloween dealt with this issue in a different way, however, by simply having Michael commit his crimes in a place you'd otherwise think of as mundane. The idyllic suburban environment of Haddonfield is where Michael was raised, and where he first killed, too. And sure, there are rumors in Haddonfield about the Myers home being a haunted house, but it's not the same kind of haunted house that had provided the basis for the gothic horror genre. This house has only been empty for some 20 years, only enough for kids and teens to think of as old. Other than that, Michael lived on a totally normal street, not a stately Victorian mansion or Eastern European castle, but an ordinary corner of the suburbs, possibly just like yours. And now, he was coming home. Movies like Halloween shifting their settings to the suburbs helped keep horror relevant, whilst making the fear more immediate and relatable. To understand just why this was so scary to audiences at the time, however, you need to look back at the history of suburbia itself. Thanks to the economic boom in the US following World War II, an increasing number of Americans found themselves with the means to move away from cities and into the residential areas that surrounded them. They could now afford single-family homes and, thanks to the interstate highway system, could also easily maintain a connection to the city by commuting to work. While some Americans found themselves moving to the suburbs in order to escape the congestion of the city, a very large number of affluent white Americans moved out there for very different reasons. At the time, they might have said it was to be closer to nature, or to have room to stretch your legs, or because suburban land was cheaper than urban real estate. But the fact is, white Americans fled the city because they were afraid of the widespread crime and unrest that they perceived as being a part of city life. White Americans were afraid of the cities and the minority populations who inhabited them, so they grabbed their children and ran away because they believed it would protect them. This process is called white flight, and it's the unspoken background radiation of Halloween's story. At one point in the film, Dr. Loomis warns the town sheriff about Michael Myers. And this is the imagery upon which Halloween is based. While the suburbs were meant to be a place of safety and leisure for American families, this movie suggests that they're simply the perfect staging ground for Michael's own unique brand of trick-or-treating. Moving out to the suburbs didn't do anything to protect the victims of Michael Myers that night. And, in fact, they might well have been safer in a city, where a greater number of people might have been around to help them, or at least call for help. Here, the protection supposedly afforded by moving away from big cities actually ended up backfiring on the families who lost their children during Michael's return home. And worse, the negligence of these parents plays a considerable role in what goes down that night. Hey, speaking of which, where are all the parents in this movie? There are practically no adults in this film at all. Dr. Loomis is there, plus a sheriff, and Laurie's dad for a hot second as he passes off some of his responsibilities and promptly drives away. But that's about it. Where are the parents of all these children Laurie and her friends are babysitting? They're nowhere to be seen. This isn't an accident, though. In fact, an entire generation of teenagers felt abandoned by their parents in the late 1970s. Coming out of the Vietnam War, this was the generation who would have felt betrayed by their parents, their communities, and most of all, their government, who turned them into cannon fodder in a war they never had any interest in. Like Myers, the war had been an uncontrollable source of violence that young people were left to by absent, apathetic adults. One of the most chilling images in the film comes when Laurie runs down the street banging on doors for help, and no one will answer or even acknowledge her. There's a lot to be said here about the individualism and selfishness of suburban life and how it causes people to insulate themselves from the violence committed against other people. This scene is ultimately reflective of the selfishness implicit in white flight. If me and mine are safe out here, who cares what happens elsewhere? In life, however, that attitude never works out well for anyone. and it doesn't in the movie either. Thanks to Halloween, suburbia has become fully ingrained in the slasher subgenre. And that's the crux of this movie. You're not supposed to be afraid so much of Michael Myers as what he represents. The idea that leaving the city behind isn't going to be enough to protect your children. You have to take an active role. You have to care, because danger could come from anywhere, and you can't just run away from it or bury your head in the sand. What's more, evil doesn't look like a minority community in a city. It can be anything and look like anyone. In fact, evil isn't even really a person, it's a shape. If you can't open up, engage with your community, and help each other, then you're not going to be able to stop it. And for some people, that's a pretty scary thing to think about.